When a country's military creates something, it's usually done for a specific purpose. That's as true of a weapon as it is of a vehicle, a bunker, or even a whole military base. When a military object's purpose no longer exists, it's not unusual for it to become abandoned. That means there are unexpected pieces of military history hiding in plain sight all over the world, and we're going to check some out in this video. There's a statue of Vladimir Lenin outside the abandoned Wunsdorf officer's house. It's a slightly strange sight because the officer's house is, as the name suggests, in Germany. You'll find it in Zossen. How is it that there's a statue of a Russian dictator outside a German military facility? The answer is that this is a former Soviet military encampment that locals refer to as the Forbidden City. There were once 75,000 Soviet soldiers here, making the largest encampment of its kind outside Soviet territory. It even had a direct train connection to Moscow. The history of the camp stretches back to 1871, when the first shooting range was built here by the Prussians. By the time World War I broke out in 1914, it was the biggest military base in Europe. The German Olympic team was temporarily based here during the famous 1936 Olympics, and it was then occupied by the German Supreme Command after Germany invaded Poland. The base fell into Soviet hands in 1945 as the Germans retreated at the end of the Second World War, and so it became the headquarters of Soviet High Command. There was a Soviet or Russian military presence here as recently as 1994, but it's been abandoned since then. The so-called Wolf's Lair in Kętrzyn, Poland, is notorious because of its association with Adolf Hitler. In fact, the Nazi leader almost lost his life here when he was targeted by a bomb hidden in a suitcase. The base was built in 1941 in an area specifically chosen for its distance from civilization. This was the most top secret of all the Nazi bases on the Eastern Front. Hitler spent most of his time here during the final 2 years of the war. The attempt on his life came not from an Allied spy, but from a German colonel who'd grown tired of Hitler's bad decisions and evil deeds. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg created a bomb inside his suitcase, fitted it with a timer, and hid it inside a meeting room that the dictator used regularly. Unfortunately, one of Hitler's aides moved the suitcase just before the meeting targeted by von Stauffenberg began. The bomb still went off, and the aide lost his leg, but Hitler suffered only minor injuries. It was enough to spook Hitler, who ordered the abandonment of the base and had it blown up with explosives as the Nazis left. The ruined shell of the building is now overgrown with lichen in the middle of a Polish forest. Fort Wadsworth on Staten Island, New York City, USA, remained in use for longer than any other fort of its kind in the country. All good things come to an end, though, and now it's little more than a forgotten concrete hulk. There's been a military encampment here since the first Dutch fort was built on Staten Island in 1663. The English seized it during the Revolutionary War in 1776. But America won its independence, and the base was occupied by the newly independent country's military. The base was extensively renovated and expanded in 1861, not long after the start of the Civil War. It was given the name Fort Wadsworth in honor of Union Army war hero Brigadier General James Wadsworth at about that time. Although its usage was scaled down during the 20th century, there was still a small army presence here until it was formally decommissioned in 1994. Today, Fort Wadsworth is part of the Gateway National Recreation Area. Parts of it remain off-limits to the public, but other parts are open for picnics, birdwatching, and even overnight camping. The word Regelbau is German for standard design, and is used to describe a series of bunker designs that were used in the construction of the enormous Atlantic Wall during the Second World War. Although parts of the wall have been destroyed, much of it is still standing. Some of what remains standing even still has some of its military hardware still attached. One such example is the fortification called Atlantic Wall Regelbau M270 Artillery Casemate in Hauts de France, also known as Batterie Valdam. As you can see, it still has its gun emplacement. There's even still some spent ammo in the basement, although there's no live ammo anywhere to be found. The installation might still look dangerous, but it's perfectly safe. It's even become a popular spot for people to come and take pictures to liven up their Instagram accounts. Rather than being something that the Germans made from scratch, they took advantage of an existing French coastal defense battery and adapted it for their purposes. There were so many guns like this here during the height of the war that the region was nicknamed Hellfire Corner. We're back to abandoned American military bases now, and we're specifically talking about Fort Pike in New Orleans, Louisiana. The function of the base and the soldiers stationed at it was to defend the city of New Orleans from the threat of invasion by sea. But the threat no longer really exists, and even if it did, the base is no longer fit for purpose. The base, named in honor of the great American soldier and explorer Zebulon Montgomery Pike, was built as part of the USA's third system of seacoast defenses in the aftermath of the War of 1812, intended to be a deterrent in the event that Britain, Spain, or anybody else fancied the idea of coming back to go another round with the American military. That day never came, though, and so the capabilities of Fort Pike were never tested. Its enormous cannons never fired a shot in anger, and were removed when the fort was formally abandoned in 1890. For many years after that, it was a state historic site in New Orleans, but was badly damaged by Hurricane Katrina and then damaged again by Tropical Storm Isaac in 2012. It now faces an uncertain future and may one day have to be torn down. Now we're moving across America and heading underground to check out the bunkers of Alvira in Allenwood, Pennsylvania. This was once a small, quiet Pennsylvanian village until it was seized by the U.S. government and turned into a military installation. The village was founded in 1825, originally under the name of Wisetown, but later became Alvira and had a population of around 100 by the time the government bought the land and created the Pennsylvania Ordnance Works in 1942. The move was a response to Pearl Harbor. The government needed to ramp up military production urgently, and Alvira was, unfortunately for its residents, in the government's way. They destroyed all the houses and created 149 concrete bunkers, but quickly realized they didn't need quite as much TNT as they once thought. The bunkers were mostly unused for the rest of the war, and the land was eventually returned to the state of Pennsylvania. To put it bluntly, it was an overreach by the government, and there was never any need for the villagers to lose their homes. Tiny traces of the village can still be found here, including the foundations of buildings and the old cemetery. Cheyenne Mountain Nuclear Bunker in Colorado Springs, USA, is probably the most famous nuclear bunker in the world. Many a television show and Hollywood movie has used the bunker as a shooting location, including Stargate and Independence Day. Those glory days are over now, though, and the bunker rarely gets any visitors. There's been a bunker here since 1961, when the government hired a mining firm to blast a series of caverns into the side of the mountain. Thanks to the water reservoirs and enormous storage facilities, anyone who was forced to hunker down in here would be safe for up to 3 years. The facility was designed to be entirely self-sufficient. In 1966, this base became the HQ of the North American Aerospace Defense Command. If the order to fire nuclear weapons had ever arrived during the Cold War, the execution of that order would have been handled here. The Cold War ended a long time ago, though, and many of the bunker's formerly state-of-the-art facilities and provisions are now obsolete. There's still an occupied office or two here, but the bulk of what was created in the 1960s is now empty. America wasn't the only country that saw sense in creating secret high-tech bunkers after the end of the Second World War. Russia also built several of them, but none so grand as Bunker 42 in Moscow. If the occasion had ever called for it, this is where Stalin himself would have taken shelter. That probably explains why there's a red carpet running down the length of its main hall. This massive base was built 165 feet below the surface of Russia's capital city, without any of the city's residents finding out. The entrance was hidden on a hillside in the Tagansky district close to the Kremlin, allowing Stalin and his top staff to transfer quickly from one place to the other if required. However, it's doubtful that Stalin ever spent much time here. He died in 1953, and the bunker didn't become fully operational until 1956. For the next 30 years, it was the Soviet Union's most important airstrike command base. It seems that the military moved out of the bunker somewhere around 1986, and it's since been reopened as a Cold War museum, offering guided tours to the public. Artillery bunkers aren't especially beautiful things to look at. They're even uglier when they've been abandoned for a long time, and their concrete structures begin to crumble. That's why the Le Francuca bunkers in France are such a breath of fresh air. These artillery bunkers were created by the Nazis during the Second World War, but in more recent years, they've begun to attract artists from all over the world. The first few artists livened them up with graffiti, but some of the bunkers now have artificial wraps, shells, and mosaic panels decorating their exterior surfaces. The bunkers were added to the site after the Germans seized Fort de Dune during the Second World War and made it part of the Atlantic Wall. The French military regained control after the war ended, but moved out in the mid-1950s after declaring the facilities obsolete. They rotted away until the 1990s, which is when the first artists were allowed to come and demonstrate their skills here. Each bunker has a different theme. One of them is even covered in mirrors, which make it a remarkable thing to look at, but a little difficult to deal with in direct sunlight. Thus far, the United Kingdom hasn't been much of an active participant in the space race. It cooperates with the efforts of the European Space Agency, but it doesn't fire up many rockets of its own. If it did, perhaps Spade Dam Rocket Test Site in Cumbria, England wouldn't look so dilapidated. As many a visitor has observed, the battered structure looks a little like a 20th century version of Stonehenge. When it was brand new, Spadedam was built for the purpose of the military rather than anything to do with space. Both the US and the UK agreed that new intercontinental missiles were required to ward off the potential threat posed by the USSR, so the US built the Atlas missile and eventually used it to blast John Glenn into space. Britain made the Blue Streak rocket vehicle and tested the 78-foot-tall device here in the barren British moorland. Blue Streak was ultimately never used as a weapon, but went on to become the first stage of the European rocket program's Europa rocket. The rocket wasn't a success, and the site was handed to the Royal Air Force to become a radar test range in 1976. Now it's no longer even considered fit for that purpose. If you want to see Cramond Ghost Island in Edinburgh, Scotland, you have to visit the city at the perfect time. You can only get to the island when the tide of the Firth of Forth is low, and it only makes sense to attempt the journey at certain times of the year due to the inherent dangers. But those who make the trip will find it to be an eerie place full of World War II relics. The island's causeway is longer than the island itself and is protected by tooth-like spikes to prevent enemy submarines or boats from reaching the coast. The island was extensively fortified during the war, due to fears that the Germans would launch an invasion via the Forth River. That's why the half-mile-long island is now covered in bunkers, gun emplacements, and former military offices. Here and there, you'll still find 19th century buildings from when Cramond Island was popular as a summer vacation retreat. Today, the island is abandoned, although it occasionally gets unplanned overnight residents when visitors fail to heed warnings about the tide and become temporarily stranded. When Nazi German forces built La Coupole in Hellfall, France, They intended to use it to fire as many as 50 V-2 rockets at London, England, every 24 hours. The structure, which is topped by an impressive dome, is made of more than 1 million tons of concrete and has storage for liquid oxygen, fuel, electricity generators, housing for officers, and, of course, rockets. Work on the facility began in 1943 and ended in 1944. Military experts consider it an early precursor of the modern underground missile silo. Despite that, it never managed to fire a single rocket. The British Royal Air Force hammered La Coupole with 6-ton tallboy bombs on July 17, 1944. They didn't manage to destroy the dome, but they caused the hillside to collapse and destroyed the 2 vertical rocket entry passages. The facility was rendered impotent and remained abandoned until 1997, when it was cleaned up and reopened to the public as a museum. Most of the museum is dedicated to the site's history of German occupation, although strangely there's also information about the history of space exploration. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!